Welcome to Lead Well, Live Whole. I'm your host, Michael Sirmon. Every episode, we'll spend a few minutes exploring the challenges, questions, and realities of everyday life, because success means little if you lose yourself in the process. So take a breath, settle in, and let's spend a few minutes exploring life together. In the last episode, we talked about the courage to say no, and the response surprised me. Not because people disagreed with it, but because so many people told me how difficult this actually was. Not the saying no part, the giving themselves permission, the living with it part. Because saying no sounds empowering when you're listening to a podcast. It sounds healthy. It sounds wise. It sounds like something emotionally mature people do until you actually do it. Then suddenly someone is disappointed, someone is frustrated, someone questions your decision. And if you're anything like me, you start replaying the conversation in your head. You begin to wonder if you were too harsh. You wonder if you maybe should have explained more. And then you wonder if you could call them back and change your answer. And that's when you realize something important. Saying no isn't usually the hard part. Living with your no is. Welcome back to Lead Well, Live Whole. I'm Michael Sirmon. Life moves fast. Responsibilities pile up. The noise gets louder. So each week we'll take a few minutes to step back, breathe, and talk about the things that really matter. I'm so glad you're here. Why does saying no feel so wrong? I think many of us grew up believing that good people say yes, good employees say yes, good parents say yes, good friends, they say yes. Good church members say yes, good leaders say yes, good neighbors say yes, good spouses say yes, good people say yes. In fact, good people sacrifice. Good people show up. In fact, in my house, my mom, who raised us, clearly said that you don't have the right to say no. So that made it hard for me to say no when I finally got to the point of, understanding that I have to protect my time. I have to protect what's important for me. So while there is a certain amount of truth in good people do all of this, there's also a danger in it. Because if we're not careful, we begin to believe that our value comes from our availability, that we're only useful when we're helping, only valuable when we're serving, only important when we're needed. And that's a heavy burden to carry, because eventually life starts asking more for more than we have to give. And when we finally say no, it feels wrong. It feels dirty. Not because it is wrong, but because it's unfamiliar. We've spent years conditioning ourselves to meet expectations, to solve problems, to step in, to rescue, to carry, to absorb, to always be Johnny on the spot or Jane on the spot. And now we're doing something different. So of course it's uncomfortable, because growth is always uncomfortable. There's a guilt piece of it, right? So let's talk about that guilt, because that's usually what shows up first. You block an evening out for yourself, you feel guilty. You turn down a commitment, you feel guilty. You choose a day of rest instead of a day of active productivity, and you feel guilty. You prioritize family over somebody or something else, and you feel guilty. You decide not to answer emails after hours and spend that time with your family. What do you feel? Guilty. And why? Because many of us have confused kindness with availability. We've confused love with accessibility. We've confused service with self-sacrifice. We've spent so much time giving ourselves away that protecting a piece of ourselves suddenly feels selfish. But here's something I've learned. The guilt doesn't always mean you've done something wrong. Sometimes guilt simply means you're doing something different. And different feels uncomfortable. In fact, our brains want to start with different is bad, different is dangerous. But the truth is, it's just uncomfortable. But don't assume discomfort means you're going in the wrong direction. Sometimes it means you're finally headed into the right one. But what are we really afraid of when we say no? And I think this is where the conversation really starts to get deeper. Because saying no often exposes fears we didn't realize we had. Sometimes we're afraid people will be disappointed. Sometimes we're afraid they'll be angry. Sometimes we're afraid they'll stop inviting us or calling us, stop needing us. Deep down, they'll stop valuing us. And that's sometimes a difficult thing to admit, because many of us have quietly built part of part of our identity around being needed. We become the helper, the fixer, the peacemaker, the dependable one, the person who always says yes, the person who always comes through. And eventually, that role becomes part of who we think we are. As we talked 2 episodes ago, a role is part of you. A role is not your identity. But one day, we say no. And suddenly it feels like we've lost a piece of ourselves, not because we're losing ourselves, but because we're discovering who we are without constantly having to prove our worth. And that's uncomfortable. But it's also very, very healthy, because our value doesn't come from our usefulness. Our value, actually, we were valuable before we started solving anyone's problems. We were valuable before we said yes. And we were valuable before anybody needed us. But no matter how valuable or how much we believe that our value is inherent in ourselves, there's going to be people who don't like our no. So what happens when people don't like that? Because that's where life starts getting real. Often, people who are used to you saying yes all the time, they're not going to like the no. They'll begin to question it. They'll start pushing back. And then they start to negotiate. And the really good ones are good at making you feel selfish. And honestly, that's because for a long time, they've benefited from your lack of boundaries. Not because they're bad people and not because they're trying to hurt you, but they've become accustomed to that unlimited access to you. They're accustomed to your availability. They're accustomed to your saying yes. And when that changes, not only are you adjusting, but they also have to adjust. And adjustment can be uncomfortable. Adjustment is change. And remember, change is scary. Change is dangerous. But one of the hardest things I've learned in life is this. A boundary doesn't reveal who loves you. It reveals those who are benefiting from your lack of boundaries. The people who genuinely care about you may not always like your boundaries, but they'll learn to respect them. And the people who only value what you do for them often struggle the most when those boundaries appear. That's not something to fear. That's something to pay attention to. But here's something I didn't expect when I started saying no more often. The space. Nobody talks about the space. We spend so much time running from one thing to another that we assume we'll automatically enjoy having margin. And sometimes we do, but more often than not, it's uncomfortable. Because busyness can be a distraction. When every moment is filled, we don't have to think about the difficult things. We don't have to examine our lives. We don't have to ask ourselves the hard questions. We don't have to notice what's missing. We just keep moving. But when you start saying no, space appears. And in that space, things begin to surface. Questions, dreams, needs, regrets, fatigue, loneliness, purpose, identity. The things we've been avoiding are now having room to speak. And that's where our real growth begins, not in the busyness, but in the quiet. The purpose of saying no isn't about protecting your calendar. It's about protecting your life. Every no creates room for something else. Room for rest, room for relationships, room for reflection, for recovery, for joy, for purpose, for the things that matter most. The question isn't whether you'll say no. The real question is what you're going to do with the space it creates. Will you immediately fill it with another obligation, another project or distraction? Or will you allow yourself to experience the gift of margin? Because margin isn't wasted time. Margin is where clarity lives. Margin is where relationships deepen. Margin is where healing happens. Margin is where we remember who we are. So here's my challenge for this week. Pay attention to what happens after you say no. Notice the guilt. Notice the discomfort. Notice the urge to explain yourself. Notice the temptation to reverse the decision. Notice how quickly you want to rush and fill that empty space. But instead of running from those feelings, sit with them for a while and ask yourself, what am I really afraid of? What is this discomfort trying to teach me? Ask yourself, what would happen if you trusted your decision? Because growth doesn't always happen when we say yes to everyone. Sometimes growth begins when we finally say yes to what matters most. Maybe you've recently said no to something, a commitment, an obligation, a request. Maybe it's an expectation, or maybe you're still wrestling with it. But if so, remember this. You don't need permission to protect what matters most. You don't need permission to rest. You don't need permission to create margin, and you don't need permission to be human. The healthiest version of you won't be found by doing more. It'll be found by becoming intentional about what deserves your yes. So thank you for spending a few minutes with me today. And if you found value in this and you can think of others who would find value in the message, please share this with them. And like and follow the Lead Well, Live Whole podcast. Remember, you are more than what you produce, more than what you accomplish, more than the responsibilities you carry. So until next time, lead well, live whole, and don't lose yourself in the process.